Christine. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Christine mentioned, my name is Roger Mazzella. I'm actually a senior product manager here with the Cute Company based out of Boston, Massachusetts. And I came into Cute Company, so a few of my roles, I head up the product in the medical health, fitness and wellness industry. Additionally, I'm in charge of Cute Solutions. And during my day, my typical day with Cute, I have the opportunity to work with a number of our partner network, our partner ecosystem, and that's who we've invited today for a panel discussion. Our partners from Fathom Consulting that do third-party UI, UX design consulting. And what we're trying to do today is, and in the description, I think, as you received it, we're trying to look at UX prototyping, including developers, and really how do we best take that UX prototyping and really kind of meet that workflow into the developer working experience. There's a lot of, the workflow can get kind of bumpy between the designer and developer. So what we've done is we've asked a number of folks here, partly from Fathom Consulting, partly from the Cute Company, to kind of talk about how we can leverage that and best practices to leverage the rapid UX prototyping, and how does that test and communicate the UX design? How does that kind of flow into the actual work that the software developers do? Our partnership, we've been partners with Fathom Consulting, for a better part of a year now. And I can tell you that we've been working on a huge project for a very big medical device customer that we mutually have. And so in doing that, we've thought it would be a great value to bring them on board, to have this discussion, start talking about, some of these best practices. So I've already introduced myself. I'd like to hand the mic over to Mary Donnelly, have her introduce herself and the rest of the panel.
Great, thank you for that, Roger. So as Roger said, I'm Mary Donnelly. I'm a principal with Fathom Consulting. I've been there for over 16 years now, and most of the work I do is doing research and design for medical device companies, doing product development. So me, along with Roger, we're going to be moderating the session today, and then we have 3 panelists. So I'll hand it over to Shawn from the Cute Company to start with, and he can introduce himself.
Thanks, Mary. Hi, Shawn Dorsey. Senior technical artist with the Cute Company, in my second year here with the company. During this time, my role is evolved as our design tool evolves. Trying to get our customers and new and current customers familiar with our design studio tool and communicate how it can help them see their designs all the way into development. I'll pass it over to Kat.
Yes, so thank you. I'm a lead consultant at Fathom Consulting, specializing in experience research and design. I've been doing UX work for 10 years and was in library and information science for 8 years before that. I focus a lot of my time at Fathom in medical device space and general healthcare space, as well as some consumer experiences, and do a lot of prototyping to understand needs up front. So less of the detailed design, but more just something quick we can put together to understand how interested someone might be in a product like this, for example. So I will pass it over to Jeff.
Hi, Jeff Harrison. I'm also user experience at Fathom Consulting. I've been at Fathom for about 10 years, and I've got about 10 years of other relevant experience before that, both as a consultant and in-house. And so my background is a little bit different from Kat's in that I came to it from graphic design. I thought my career was going to be graphic design when I graduated, and then the web happened, and it's a long story, but here I am. And so what Kat and I both have in common, though, is that we do have a fair amount of contact with users, and we use prototyping to explain potential interactions, interfaces, and to answer questions for ourselves about what they need.
Great, thank you for that, you guys. All right, so we do, as Christine said in the beginning, really encourage you to ask questions throughout. And to start out with, we'd really like to hear from you. What is one thing you will be doing before the new year? And if you want to go ahead and put that up as well into the poll, Kristen. And you should be able to respond to this in the Q&A. So I'll just give everybody a moment to respond there. So that if you click on the Q&A within the Zoom, you should be able to respond to that question.
And
Okay.
I'm not able to put mine in the Q&A, but I have a goal before the end of the year to digitize some old home movies. To see how far I get. But
That's a good one. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, one thing I want to mention too to the audience is we have some questions that were discussion points that the panel is going to discuss, but we encourage our audience to actually continue to ask questions during the whole presentation. We're not going to hold your questions to the end. We're going to filter in some of the questions as we're discussing, take them live. We'll see how that goes, but we certainly have some discussion topics prepared for you, but we don't want a really interactive session here. That's why we're not presenting and you see our faces. So feel free to fill in your Q&A as they come up, and we're going to start handling them as we go.
Great, perfect for that. All right, so to start out with here, so when Jeff and Kat introduced themselves, they talked a lot about prototyping, and I think this word prototyping can really be used to refer to lots of different things. So really just kind of want to shed some light on how we're going to use it in the context of today's discussion. So I want to give Shawn and Jeff both a chance to define what we mean when we say prototype. So let's start out with Jeff. So Jeff, can you tell us from your perspective, when you use the word prototype, really what are you referring to?
Sure. So broadly speaking, a prototype is, a model of something that would take longer to build. And the reason that you prototype is you want to figure something out before you take the trouble to build the whole thing. So as a user experience practitioner, the kinds of questions that I'm often trying to answer with prototypes are things like, does the if I'm doing application design, does this flow through various screens make sense to users? And so I would get a user to actually interact with the prototype and go through, talk aloud, and I can learn something that way. In other cases, some of our clients haven't even really figured out what they want to build yet. And so we're not really doing screen design. It's more like a concept. So we're creating some sort of concrete example of what this product that we have in mind could be, and just trying to, it's a little bit more open-ended than simply a navigational task, but we're trying to understand, do people understand what this is? And do they have, is it going to fit into their lives if we go ahead and build it this way? So those are the kinds of questions that I try to answer with prototypes. And as such, my prototypes are typically fairly lightweight, ugly, honestly. You usually don't put a lot of effort into making them look nice, but they're also really easy to update and if we want to change our direction as we go.
Thank you for that. And what mediums are you usually using? So is this digital? Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so often they're digital, not always, but often. So on the more interaction design end, we use a tool called Axure, A-X-U-R-E. It's really one of the, it's one of the industry standards. There are other ones like Sketch and Figma that are great for communicating different kinds of animations, and you can walk people through flows there, and those are really optimized for particularly mobile UI design, but UI design in general. I am also not above just drawing some rectangles on a PowerPoint slide and sharing that if that's what it takes. It really kind of depends on whether I'm trying to test an interaction or whether it's just a concept.
Great, thank you for that. And Shawn, it'd be great to hear from you as well. So when you are talking about the word prototype or using it to refer to design and development, how do you define prototype?
Sure, and Jeff nailed it. But just to add to it, when I think about it, and when I'm laying out a design, I go back to education. I think of like the 4 F's, the form, function, fit, and finish. And that prototype is the form and the function part of it over the fit and finish. And it's that early stage snapshot of it, before it gets the look and feel. And it's, allows you to explore and interact and really understand the basic functionality prior to it really looking beautiful. And, the goal for that prototype is you want to cover as many scenarios as you possibly can and simulate those real world experiences. You try to get as much information as you can before you really fall in love with it and start building in that beautiful fit and finish.
Great, yeah, thank you for that. If there are other ways out there that folks are defining the word prototype or using it in different contexts, it'd be great if you could enter that into the Q&A and let us know if there's different ways that you refer to prototype.
Yeah, and
Your pro-
Mary, I
your
just
proto-
want to interject with something with what Jeff and Shawn are saying. We talk about prototype and everyone uses prototype, and then this gets filtered down to the developers and they use prototype. If we're all using the same word, is there a different way that you guys differentiate, and Kat, you as well, differentiate the stage of the prototype that it's in, right? When it's really early and it's that straw man or that wireframe, to something a little more polished, and as it gets to be iterated. Are you guys identifying that? And then eventually when that hands off, you have some kind of a definition that, it is hands off to developers, or does it, because I could see in some of the work that I've done that gets kind of muddled, right? That the definition of that gets muddled. So, what phase of the prototype it is in can be very informative. How do you guys, just as a follow on, how do you guys handle that? And what do you use as best practice to make sure that the definition stays consistent or the progress stays consistent?
I have a thought on that. I mean, I think it definitely is a real pain point, and I think both Qt and Fathom kind of coming from outside into a different company environment, and different companies think of these things different ways. Different organizations have different understandings of these things, as well as different silos within the organization. So I tend to, the very early up front, Jeff used the word concept. I use that word a lot. I don't even sometimes use the word prototype. It's more of a concept or a sketch. In the middle, I generally call those a UX prototype, meaning it's here to prototype the experience itself. And then as we get further down, maybe something like a detailed or a high fidelity prototype would have more resemblance of how it will end up looking. And then I also sometimes use the phrase annotated prototype, meaning it's actually has our notes from the research right in it, or it actually is more directive of how to build it than just a walkthrough. Jeff and Shawn, I'm sure you guys have things to add. But.
Sure, yeah, and that's a great question, because there's, when a client comes to me and says, I need a prototype, like that's flag right there, because what we've found is that word is an empty vessel into which stakeholders can pour all of their hopes and dreams about the future. It turns out that the thing that you build to test a navigation scheme is not good. It doesn't look like what they want to show to their executives, or there's just a mismatch there. And so Kat's answer makes a lot of sense to me, and so I do some of those things too. But I've also been trying to intentionally stick adjectives onto the front of it that kind of tells you what it's for. Like, we have one client where no matter what else we do, we'll create some sort of prototype, we'll get it tested, we'll have findings and all the rest. But almost invariably, the last thing in the project is to create a shiny version of that so that they can shop it around to people, right? And we don't want to be shiny up front, because shiny takes longer up front. So definitely we have the evaluation prototype, and then there's the presentation prototype, and they're two different things.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And Jeff, so one of the questions we had from the audience here is, do you find it challenging to get the audience, which I'm assuming they mean like the users that you'd be showing the prototype to understand that they're providing input into a prototype, right? So something that isn't, very design versus really wanting to focus on the design. Kind of, could you talk a little? Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And like, it is a thing you have to deal with. Typically, I guess maybe practice goes into it a little bit. So at this point, I'm not too afraid of that because I'm usually pretty good at talking people through it, but you do have to talk people through it. The other thing is, and so if I can just share for a second, I anticipated something like this. I'm going to go ahead and show you. I have a genericized version of a navigation prototype. So this is one that was created in Acture, which is the tool I was looking at before. Nobody, I hope. So you can click through this. This was kind of an early stage prototype that I did several years ago. This is for a case management system. So the user might be like a social worker or someone similar in that role. And so we're looking up information about, you can tell it's several years ago from the shape of the navigation and all that. But nobody's going to mistake this for something that like looks finished or that where I'm actively soliciting feedback on the visual design. And so really, like, not only does it work to my advantage to not worry about that because I'm not sinking time into drop shadows and stuff and those kinds of details, but there's really nothing there to react to. So that's the quick answer.
All right. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think someone said that they often talk about low versus high fidelity prototype. So I'm assuming what you showed there would be considered more of a low fidelity versus something that was further designed out.
Super low.
Yes. All right.
Well,
Great.
and I
While
also
others
think,
go high, I go low.
well, and I think Jeff brings up another thing. It's about setting expectations, right? What is the expected outcome? So, we have two companies here that work very well together. One that's a little further towards the development side where Shawn bridges that gap. And then you folks who are more on the early fuzzy front end design. And then when we come and work with a customer, they have different definitions and different expectations. So I think with Jeff, one of the things that I got out of your answer is make sure early and often managing those expectations of what do you say, what are you talking about when you're talking about a deliverable or a prototype or fidelity or whatnot, right? I think that was a great point.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. All right, so now we're going to jump into talking about how teams decide what to prototype, when to test. And I think, Kat, if you could take this one, it'd be great. So just if you could expand a little bit on, when you decide to start testing and how you prepare for it, recruit, decide on the format.
Sure. Yeah, I think all of those are important decisions that, that you just listed off, like what's the right timing, who are the right people to show it to. But to me, I always think your prototype is something that you want to test, right? And so you have a hypothesis, you have some assumptions, maybe something about the way the product is being used today, but you don't know about how it might be used in the future. So really the first step of prototyping for me is really just gathering all of that. What are the things we need to know? What are the things that we think are really key to the success of this design or of this product or service? Because not everything is. Some things aren't going to matter. If the navigation's here or there, it won't matter. In some products, it'll matter a lot in other products. So it's really the team coming together and saying, these are the things that we think are really going to be make or break for our product, the tasks that people have to be able to do easily, the things that they have to be able to understand to use it right up front. And then those are the things you prototype, right? And those are the things that you make sure you get right. And the rest of it can fade into the background a little bit. And I say that only because, you could prototype for days and days and days and try and answer every question, but then you almost might as well have just built it at that point. So to me, it's really focusing in, I tend to think like somewhere between 5 and 12, maybe tops. Like these are the things we absolutely need to know before we develop anything. They're the big forks in the road or the key things that if you don't get this right, everything's going to fail. And then like get those down on paper. What are the hypotheses? What are the assumptions? What do we need to know about this? And then figure out what's the smallest thing I could prototype to get this answer. how minimalist, how lightweight could I be to just give the user a suggestion of something and have them come back at me with an answer. There's kind of a famous UX case study of a company that wanted to find out if architects would like carry an iPad around to do design on. And the first thing they did was actually just get like a small pizza box and weight it with a few little things inside to make it the same weight as an iPad, right? And then like, that's a pretty small prototype, and just to see, would they actually carry it with them? And that was like the first thing they needed to know. And then if the answer is yes, then we have a bunch of other questions we'll get to in other rounds. And so I guess that's where I started. Is like, what are the questions we really need answers? What's the smallest thing we could prototype to get those answers? And then in terms of recruiting and getting everything kind of set up, it's just that's when you start to say, well, when do we need an answer, and back into when do we need to get started? So you'll need a couple of weeks to recruit. You'll probably want a couple of weeks because you'll want to show something and iterate at least once and show something new, because you'll learn so much from the first 6 people that you realize all the ways you were wrong, and you want one more stab at it. And you need a little time to do some analysis at the end. So you start to kind of back into like, well, we probably need 6 weeks here or something, depending again how big the questions are. And then how quickly can you get your prototype done? Like, is it going to take you a little while just to get that done? Yeah, but those are my thoughts on that. Jeff, Shawn, if you have other things to add, feel free.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know, like, how do you know when to stop testing?
Yeah. That's a good question too. So to me, it goes back to those things that you wrote down as deal breakers and as make or break for your product. And if you feel like you have the answers to those, then you can be done. It's very possible and very likely that you will have raised a new set of questions that you'll need to go do a different prototype test. I think as we get into usability testing, then I tend to want people to write down how good they think it needs to be before they're done. So if 80% of people can, put this in their cart and check out, is that good enough? Or do you want us to keep testing and tweaking until we're at 95%? And that's a decision that will be really different in a medical realm than in a consumer realm. Although maybe not in the ways you would guess. So I think the important thing, is to get that down on paper ahead of time, because otherwise you will just kind of feel like you want to keep tweaking and iterating forever. But if you can say, hey, we said we'd iterate on this until we answered these 4 questions, and 80% of people could use it without, a hiccup, and we've done that, then it's time to move on. I'm sure other folks have other answers to that too. But
Yeah, I mean, I think what resonates for me in your answer, Kat, is just the upfront when you're doing that definition. I mean, actually, in another conversation I was part of today, this came up. It was a little different context, but the more you can define your objectives and prepare and know what you're going to test and what you're going to ask, the better your synthesis and analysis and all that is going to go. And the more clear, it'll be clear at a certain point that you're not learning as much as you used to, or maybe you're up against it, really. But yeah, that preparation, like, you don't just show up in the lab and start like showing people stuff and treat it like a brainstorming session or something. There's a fair amount of work that goes into planning these.
Yeah.
And I won't spend too much more time on this one, but when I've been involved in multiple projects where either you had a lot of information, detailed information, personas set up, and then when you get into like a testing, you forget and fall completely outside of those personas that you'd set up. So you're testing a different group that's going to offer different feedback, and then you're back to square one, essentially rebuilding based on feedback which you didn't anticipate when you initially started the project. So being aware of those things early on is what I felt is good versus bad.
Yeah, it's great. I want to take a moment, everyone. We've got quite a number of really good questions coming from the audience. We really appreciate this. So this one I'm going to ask, and I'll leave it out to the group, but I can say that I've done this, and sometimes the transition over is a little bit interesting. So we have someone asking, how often should designers use guerrilla usability testing to gain insights during prototype development versus more thorough usability testing? Now, I did this I used to work for a fitness manufacturer, and I was in charge of the console on top of these cardio pieces of equipment. So we would have it back in our workshop. So we would look at the gorilla type of usability of just getting people around the office. Come here, come try this, right? And then the real funny one is when we would go to the gym, and I'd be sitting there with a piece of paper and watching people work out. And I was like, who's that creepy guy watching me run on a treadmill? And I have to go up to go, no, I work for that company. I'm interested in getting some feedback. So I see that as guerrilla usability, where you're just going in and just watching and seeing people's behavior. And then you have some more of the more traditional things, a process. Can we hear from the group on your experience with that and when to use one versus the other?
Oh, I think you're muted, Jeff.
I was waiting to see if anybody else wanted to. But I mean, I think, so guerrilla usability testing is great. And it's great for ways that Roger, what you just said, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. It's easy, right? You can make it happen really fast. Now, it depends a little bit on what your product is. So if you can go into a gym and see your product in use, then, you're set. And so, even in projects where you might do something a little more structured and formal, I think there's still, that can still be another great source of input. And I'm all for it. I'm not at all doctrinaire when it comes to you must do it this way. I'm not I did not come up through human factors. I do not own a lab coat. So we are. But it does depend, right? You can't always do that. And a lot of the times, so a lot of our clients are med device clients, and the devices themselves might be inside of patients, and the systems that we're doing usability testing on are not publicly available. And so, obviously your options for guerrilla testing at that point, they're diminished. Doesn't mean you can't still create a quickie prototype and approach people in the hall. But the other piece that tends to come hand in hand with that in those more specialized systems is that the end users they have specialized knowledge. These are often not walk up and use systems. So I can create a great prototype of this system that we're designing. But if I set up a table at Starbucks and pay people $20 to look at my prototype, they're not going to be able to tell me anything useful about it because they don't know anything about the system in question.
Well, and Jeff, and just that's a great point, and I just want to follow up with that because when you're dealing with the medical device industry and you have human factors requirements and stuff, and you're approaching people in a professional situation like doctors and nurses and technicians, is there still a use for guerrilla usability testing with them, or is the expectation that this is supposed to be formal because we're in a more of a formal state versus let's say a consumer medical device where it's users that may be using it on a day-to-day basis and they're not in that professional realm, but they're basically people like us, patients and stuff like that. Is there a leniency or an expectation that more of a formal type of usability testing and guerrilla usability testing in other ways is it all applied regardless?
So I guess I would say both will end up being useful, right? You'll get something useful out of the guerrilla data if it's a medical device, and you can find people who, for consumers. But if you're planning to submit anything that says this is how we know this product is safe and works well, then you better be pretty formal about it, because it's the documentation that's required for that is pretty rigorous. And they definitely have a different philosophy on that. But it doesn't mean you couldn't learn something from the guerrilla that actually maybe even informs your usability testing. It may even inform your success metrics. It may let you know where you want to focus, what tasks are going to be the hardest, but it won't sort of count towards your formal usability submission.
Are those specialized users open to guerrilla use? Like a doctor or nurse, a technician, are they open to that, or are they more their expectation more of a formal
I think it
process?
depends on the environment. I think you might be able. We have certainly grabbed people at conferences where they're a little more off the clock and very interested in seeing what's new out there. It's very much what's in it for me, right? So if sometimes if you could make people feel like they're getting a sneak peek at something, or they have some insider or some ability to influence your roadmap. People are interested in that, potentially even more interested in that than money, honestly. But I think it depends on the environment. I think if you're stopping someone in the hallway of a hospital, that can be a much trickier intercept. The other thing I was just going to add, we're talking about appropriateness for guerrilla testing by role, but I think also by just demographics. So we did a test on a smartwatch that was specifically made for seniors. And it was a small company. Every single person in that company had worn the watch for a month and found it to be highly usable. We brought in, I think, only 6 or 7 folks that were 70 and older, and most of them struggled a lot because they had at least a slight tremor, and the watch registered a tap as a swipe because of the tremor in their finger. So if we had relied only on people 50 and younger to test that device in a guerrilla environment, we would have never learned that. And it was a very simple fix for the developers to say, okay, just make it so a long press and a tap do the same thing, right? Or it would register as a long press because they weren't sort of removing their finger quickly enough. So if you want to do guerrilla testing, I think there's a time and a place for that, but make sure you're still testing with the right people. Otherwise you get invalid results, which is actually worse than no data at all.
Okay. Anyone else want to comment?
Nope, they nailed it.
Okay, good. Let me just follow up just because of I think it applies here. When we're talking about, and I think this applies a lot to the guerrilla approach, would it be acceptable to include any information lacking within a prototype in a presentation to a client? Or at least the point you just try to add it in, or at that point, would you just try to add it into the prototype? I'm not sure who would be best to answer that question. Anybody can take it. Again, the question is, would it be acceptable to include any information lacking within a prototype in a presentation to a client? I'm assuming context and stuff like that. Or at that point, we just try to add it into the prototype.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a couple ways this can be interpreted. Information, obviously any information that you can get when someone is testing it is useful information. If it's so much as to say, is when you are presenting it and you mention that it's lacking in certain areas, then you may be guiding the user.
And I think that's what the question's getting at. How much
Yeah.
information can you give maybe around it, or context around it, that you're not leading the witness, so to speak, or leading them to a conclusion? Yeah, I think there's a certain sensitivity to that. I think that's what this question is really getting at.
Yeah. I mean, I think you might see it in 2 different phases, and maybe you start your testing out and you don't mention that information, and then perhaps maybe your testers are getting stuck, and then maybe you start to infer some information in there to guide them a little bit more. But I don't think, at least in my practice, you don't really lead with that. But definitely that information that you're capturing as well as providing should be noted as you continue that prototype and that development. All of that is incredibly useful information.
Okay. Anyone else? Yeah, I would say.
Actually, I want to ask Shawn. So Shawn, because honestly, I'm going to just confess this this question and that answer. Like, I think I'm kind of tracking, but it also feels a little abstract. So not to put you on the spot, Shawn, but you're on the clock, so here we go. Like, can you give me any examples of, like, when you say all of that information is really useful, what kinds of information are you thinking about?
So, if we just take a basic demonstration, I'll just go back to, like, Roger's example of a treadmill or a fitness, some type of fitness information, and say you have a tester that's hopping on the treadmill and exercise bike, what have you, and they're not really understanding how to use it properly, or even turn it on or turn it off in an emergency case. And you're identifying these things as you're visually seeing them, like they're pointing their finger around, trying to find different things, and tracking how long it might take for them to find the right button so they can get started. It's not something that you can record, whether you have a camera around you or not, but you can note this information. Like, okay, so this person's not able to find within the layout of an operation that needs to get them going. So that is useful because maybe you're not leading them around in such a way that is user friendly. That's really where I'm getting at. It's that information that you're getting from watching a user for the first time, or guerrilla testing, that can be very useful, that maybe you need to rearrange things. Does that answer somewhat?
Yeah, I think so. And then the question is just like whether that goes back to your client. I mean, because, well, yeah, I mean, for sure, what you brought up just now, like that seems like something your client probably wants to know about if someone can't figure out how to turn on their device.
Yeah, that's a very vague answer, on the spot answer, but
That's
yeah.
totally fine. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, as a researcher, you have some discretion about what you think. Hopefully you've had enough conversations with your client to know what they're after and what the goals of the project are, and you have some discretion about what you emphasize. But I would definitely, I think you put that information in the presentation. Going back to the initial question, if the question is, do you have to add all these details and additional detailed recommendations into a prototype? It kind of depends on what the expectations are and what the next steps are with that prototype. If it's a prototype that's going to be, that developers are going to be looking at while they're going to be looking at it on one screen while they're coding an actual interface, then it's probably more important to incorporate additional details into a prototype. If this is more directional, then maybe the prototype has served its purpose, and it's your findings that contain the wisdom.
Yeah, it goes back to that real world scenario. What's actually happening with it? What information can you gather from those real world scenarios, as opposed to providing it up front? I'm a fan of breaking things, so when someone breaks it, it's very useful for me.
Great, thank you. So we wanted to talk a little bit about projects going from the designer to the developer. So we often encounter projects in which the designer to developer workflow can be quite redundant. So we want to talk just now kind of where you see some of the efficiencies. But before we get into that, it'd be great to understand from the audience that we have today where you folks are really spending the most of your time on projects. So Christine, if you can go ahead and launch poll number 2. Thank you for that. So if everyone can answer this question, we can kind of get some additional information on who we have participating in the webinar today. And then Shawn, as folks are answering that, it'd be great to understand from you, where are you seeing efficiencies today in some of the tools that you use, especially when you're thinking about communicating testing results and design changes from developer to designer, or just kind of communicating with each other in general?
Sure. Yeah. So, I get to chat with a lot of design teams, all over the globe. And, the pain points that I hear when talking to majority of these other teams are, just how much information, documentation that they need to provide, from that designer to developer workflow. And that's, that can be a number of things, or flow charts, spec sheets, interaction tables, and also wrapping up all the digital files that gets passed over to the developer, that developer, wherever they sit, has to decipher and unwrap all that information and write it in code. And then, hopefully it resembles that original design intent. Now, think about it nowadays, and I'll just use March as our example because we're now a little bit fully dependent on tools like Zoom and Teams, and for our interactions from designer to developer and throughout the entire team. And there are the tools that have always been used, like a Jira, Trello, Confluence, and Slack. Those are all great tools because they're web-based, they're live, they don't require you to install another application. You can use them in your browser. Now, we talked about, I think I heard Jeff talk about Figma, and that's another asset creation type tool, and that lets you build your entire design within it, similar to a sketch. But what's really cool about Figma is that it really has a nice collaboration part in it that, that allows you to annotate your designs in there, and that information can be interpreted, from the developer's hands to show what is actually intended. So it keeps it inclusive in the design. It communicates, whether it's an interaction or something else in the flow. And that's what that's a tool that I really like right now. And I see huge efficiencies in less tabs you have to open up, or application you have to open up to handle that designer to developer workflow. Anyone else, feel free to jump in.
That made sense. I have no way of improving on Shawn's answer. It just appears from the poll results that we're preaching to a partial choir anyway. Shout out to all the researchers, usability testers out there.
Right.
Yeah, and Jeff, while we're talking about tools, and especially with COVID right now, have you experienced product development teams working differently together during COVID? Or have you seen approaches to testing different?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I have, so as you know, Mary, we do a lot of remote testing anyway, even in a non-pandemic environment, which it's a shame we need a term for non-pandemic environment, but here we are. So depending on who, we also do face-to-face. And so depending on how much time you have and your budget and where your participants are, face-to-face can make a lot of sense, or sometimes you just have to do remote practically. And of course, now that nobody wants to go outside, there's a lot more remote work. So I think that I don't know if it's like, from my standpoint, it hasn't really revolutionized how teams are working together. I'm working with a team right now that's based in California, and there's some cute resources on there too, and they're all over the place. And so it's the sort of typical distributed team. I find that even when I work with teams where a lot of them are in the same building, though, they're still using tools like Confluence and Jira. And so I think it's interesting that at least in this way, like a lot of teams are kind of prepared for this. I think it cuts off some choices that you might have had when it comes to enlisting user input. So, you have to really rely on screen share, and moderating remote sessions is a little bit different than moderating in-person sessions. So there's a little bit of, if you haven't done it before, there's a little bit of a transition there. But given all the other changes that I see around me, like, I don't know, it's, all I can say is thank goodness we have collaboration tools in the cloud already. It made this pretty seamless.
I would say a big way that I see teams working differently is less like collaborative workshops and kind of more on the team side and less even on the testing side. Just get, everyone come to the Fathom office for an afternoon, and we'll like sketch all these designs, and we'll hang them around the wall, and we'll pick them apart, and we'll take what we like from this person's design and literally tape it together with that person's design. A lot of that has gotten a lot harder. I have done some really good workshops with a tool called Mural that's web-based and allows people to, at least put up sticky notes. I know Jeff can do some drawing in it. I'm not there with it yet. But we could at least put up sticky notes of, the things we need to build and what we need to know about them, that process of like what even needs to be in the prototype. And then, obviously having digital prototyping tools that live in the cloud is huge as well, because you can send your client a quick link and they can take a look. And so many of them have good, as we mentioned, Figma is outstanding in this area, ability to leave comments or questions, or multiple people to be editing it, so that kind of thing. But I do think there's something around the ideation and that first creative gambit that is pretty hard to replicate. And I think the best solution I found is to break it up so that it's no longer a full day. And instead we take it in chunks, and then just to use tools so everybody can. I think one of the key pieces with Mural is that everyone can see it and still see each other on their Zoom, versus when I share a screen and we're walking through PowerPoint or something, then everyone's picture is really tiny. So it's those little things sometimes of like, I could see the activity and I could see your face at the same time, that made it still feel like we were in the same room.
And I actually want to add, one more thing about that. I mentioned other tools, but I touched a little bit about the Qt Design Studio tool, and really just to talk a little bit more about that. It's a tool that was built for this designer to developer workflow, and it has functions in it like a annotation editor for a developer to understand what the designer is trying to do. So with that, that WYSIWYG, what you see is what you get, visual editor. There's also code that's being written in QML at the exact same time. So the designer can do things visually, like create an animation or create a flow or an interaction of some sort. And that gets written in code, but also built into the tool is the sticky notes, like Kat was saying, but it's the annotation editor that tells either a specific person or a group within the same tool that this is what I'm trying to do, from a designer level to a developer level. And it maybe alleviates one or two of those documents that used to be, provided in that workflow. So that's one of the things, with the Design Studio tool that you get is, trying to create efficiencies in that workflow.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. Going back to a couple of questions from the audience, and this one I believe is for you, Jeff, and it's refers to the low fidelity and prototyping that we're talking about in the beginning. But the question is, when you're presenting low fidelity prototypes to stakeholders or clients, you talked about avoiding receiving feedback about fit and finish, but specifically what kinds of feedback and question and answers do you look for instead? Or do you use it as a tool to present your findings from early research and not so much for getting critique?
So, okay, yeah, good question. So yeah, definitely, mostly what I'm doing is not so much looking for critique, although some people will be happy to offer up a critique, whether you look for it or not. But one of the ways that we started talking about the prototypes that we create, especially the ones that we're showing to end users, it's not so much that we're looking for their opinions about whether it's good, but we talk about these prototypes in terms of stimulus. So we show them something and then we watch them to see what they do or what they say. So what I don't usually want is, and I realize the question is talking about stakeholders or clients. So I'll get to that. But what I don't want from users is for them to put on a design hat and then try their hands for their first time at UI design. When it comes to your clients, for sure they're going to be, they're going to give you their opinions about how well something works. What I try to do in those conversations, particularly before we've shown anything to a user, is try to understand to what extent this meets the need. To what extent does it meet the requirements? And the kind of feedback you're going to get is there's too many clicks, for example, which is a popular one. Or, we need to make sure that they see this or that. Or, people will have their opinions on the interaction. And from that, that's how you generate, that's a good way of generating questions that you then test with users. Because sometimes, if there are cases where some people see a problem and other people see something working perfectly well, then that's something that we want to specifically work into our test protocol. After people have seen that, after people have watched usability testing happening or whatever kind of evaluation you're doing, that really, if you've done your planning well and you have specific objectives for it, I tend to find that super helpful in focusing the clients on the right kinds of questions. Stop there. Occasionally I will pull out some sort of little demo that, you know, if people are super focused on aesthetics or something, to say that this wireframe really does equal a, you know, it does represent something that's going to look nicer up front. But I think once people are involved with the process of evaluation, they usually get it.
Okay, great. Let me just say, you know, we're coming up towards the top of the hour. We have some other questions here from the audience. What we don't get to, we'll be happy to answer offline after the session. So we make sure we get to all of your questions. But I have one here. And Shawn, maybe you could expand upon this, because I know you started talking about Design Studio. Maybe you could expand upon it a little bit from this question, and then others can comment. The question is, you know, we hear a lot about customer experience and how important it is. What techniques and tools do you use to define and communicate what the experience will actually be? Again, I know, you know, a few different tools have been talked about. Shawn, I'll let you start off, and then let Kat, Jeff comment as well.
Sure. Yeah. So, you know, if you look at where I think, you know, the question is asking, you know, if you look at the flow from, you know, it could be a napkin sketch, or, you know, some kind of sketch it starts out with, and then it gets into, you know, more of a asset creation tool, wireframing tool, like a, you know, say Sketch or Adobe XD for that matter. And then, you know, that can be what, you know, some of us call a clickable wireframe. And, you know, that gives you some semblance of what interactions are going to be. You know, to go back into like what the Qt Design Studio tool is additionally great for is, you know, what I mentioned previously about how it's, you know, it's an editor, a visual editor. You can put in all your interactions, but also you can hook it up to the actual hardware and see it running on a live device, you know, the target hardware that's intended for whatever you're running it on. So that, you know, that helps you with that customer experience, because then it's the actual screen, it's the actual device, it's the hardware. It, you know, gives you a snapshot of, you know, what's the frame rate going to be. You know, it really helps you define what that full experience is going to be, rather than, you know, clicking through it on the desktop with a mouse. You know, this is touch screens. This is potentially using multi-touch. You know, that's a great tool and an early phase design tool to help you define what that experience will be.
I feel like when I hear about customer experience, I think folks are thinking even broader, like outside of the user experience of this one part of the product or this one product, and you know, how does the user find out about it? How do they receive it? What's the packaging like? You know, what if they need to call for support? So really all those surround pieces and how you might design those too. And that's a super interesting, you know, area. And I think in terms of techniques, to me, I think you can actually prototype a ton of that as well. So, you know, go ahead and take a pass at prototyping the packaging. We've certainly prototyped quick start guides. And often right on the heels of prototype and usability testing the product is right when you're ready to write that quick start guide, because you know the things that people struggled with. You know, you did the best design you could, but this, you know, Shawn was mentioning the context earlier. This was the missing piece of context that we really have no choice but to put in a quick start guide. So thinking about some testing that was meant to be done in our lab, and we ended up doing in people's homes so that they wouldn't have to come out of their homes. Again, we're talking about adaptations to COVID, and they were physical prototypes, and we put them in a big plastic bin just to move them around and move them from house to house and make them just easy to keep clean. But some of our participants actually took that as part of the customer experience. Like they thought that it would be delivered to their doorstep in a big plastic bin. They were super happy about that, but that was not actually what the experience was going to be. So I think it's, you know, there are ways to prototype all those surrounding pieces too. And if you accidentally do it, then you probably learned something from that too, even if it wasn't what you set out to learn.
Great, thank you for that. So we are almost at time. I think we got to most of the questions that were asked here. But, if there are additional questions, or, we really would like to know what else you would like to learn about, either more about something we have discussed today or something that we didn't discuss today at all. So please go ahead and put that into the Q&A now. I appreciate that. Then I'm going to hand it over to Roger or Christine here to wrap up the session. So thank you so much for everyone who joined today.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Yes, pleasure.
Christine, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Hello, everybody. So if you do not have any questions, then we will wrap up today's session. But if you do, please go ahead and submit it into the Q&A pane, or you can reach out to us directly at info@qt.io, or contact us through our webpage at qt.io/contact-us. And we are very happy that you joined us all today and asked our experts some great questions and made this a very interactive session with the poll answers and the comments. So I do not see any questions coming in. So we will go ahead and wrap up today's session, and we thank you all for joining us live today.
Yeah, good luck to everyone.
Thanks,
on
everyone. Great
finishing up the new
participation.
year. Bye.